Hello and welcome to Let's Talk, a series of podcasts produced by the Hazel and Betty Ford Foundation on the issues that matter to us, the issues that we know matter to you too. Substance use prevention, research, treatment of addiction, recovery management, advocacy, and education. I'm your host, William Moyers, and today we're joined by my colleague, Dr. Kristen Schmidt, an addiction psychiatrist for Hazel and Betty Ford based in Minnesota. Welcome, Dr. Schmidt.
Thank you.
And today we're talking about women in addiction and women in recovery. Why do we need to differentiate between women and everybody else in treatment?
Well, because there is a difference between women and men, and we know that biologically there is a difference in terms of substance use and relapse. We know that psychologically, environmentally, there's a difference between women and men, and the outcomes can be different if, we don't take those things into account.
What makes women particularly vulnerable to substances, legal or illegal?
First, I guess we'll touch on the biological component. So females have the hormone estrogen versus males. And what we know is that estrogen has been found to increase both animal and actual human females in studies, increase the intake and consumption of substances. So we've seen actually female rats will start to increase their alcohol intake compared to male rats when the concentration of alcohol is increased. We know that the males start to titrate off their alcohol use, whereas the females will continue to use. We also know that in terms of women who enter treatment, they tend to have more severe addiction when they enter treatment. They actually are more medically compromised, specifically because of their bodies. So women have less of the enzyme used to break down alcohol than men do.
The metabolism issue.
Right, the metabolism issue. So women, my female patients, their lab values oftentimes are much worse than my male patients, despite the fact that they're much younger. And I always talk with my patients about that, and I let them know that there is a phenomenon we refer to in research as telescoping, where women, their bodies just can't take the substances to the same degree that males can. And so it's so important that once they're in treatment that they really understand that medical difference and that they try and stop.
So physiology certainly has a huge factor, as you said. What about external factors that women then internalize?
Right. So we know environmentally that women tend to be relational substance users. So being in a relationship where the male partner is using substances, it is so much harder for women to stop using substances as a result. There was one study that showed that 50% of heroin users, female heroin users, the first time they ever injected was from a male partner. This is compared to 90% of males saying that a friend of theirs first injected them. So I've had patients tell me, my female patients, who have actually woken up and they've had a needle in their arm from their partner, and they weren't even aware that had happened. So there's always that environmental, relational concern. And then women are caretakers. So oftentimes they have children, and that influences their ability to access treatment, because oftentimes they can't take their children with them, and they don't know what to do in terms of their kids if they want to get treatment. They did a recent study on methamphetamine use, and they found that one of the reasons women used methamphetamine, reported using, was actually so they could go to work, take care of their kids, clean the house, and they really wanted that extra energy as a component of their use.
What about sexual abuse and the role that it plays in the substance use disorder in women?
Yeah, so we know that they did a study looking at female sex workers who were in Canada, and they found that 75% of those females who had suffered abuse before age 18 went on in 6 months to start injecting substances. So abuse plays a huge role. We know that females who have PTSD are 5 times more likely to become substance users than women who haven't had some kind of serious trauma in their lives.
So you and I did another podcast on trauma-informed care that our listeners and our viewers can tune into. But trauma certainly plays a huge force and is a factor in what happens to women under the influence, correct?
Oh, absolutely. And actually what we find is, women who are under the influence tend to actually contract things like HIV and hepatitis, as well as other sexually transmitted diseases, adverse pregnancy outcomes because of substance use. And oftentimes what happens is the female will still take the gender role of using after her partner. So she becomes then the recipient of these possible transmissible diseases.
So let's talk about what happens when a woman comes into treatment. That's Hazel and Betty Ford. How do we tailor treatment to fit the needs specifically of women?
So one of the things that we do is we really advocate for self-efficacy. So self-efficacy, I simply define as the ability for a woman to articulate what she wants, and not only articulate it, but have faith that it will actually happen. They've looked at Harvard. There's a woman called Shelley Greenfield. She's done a lot of work on women's recovery group, and what she found is that if you have manuals and you have therapies that are tailored specifically to women's issues, so things like child care, things like self-esteem, things like body image, which is huge for my female patients, eating disorders, things like that. If you are mindful of those issues, women tend to do much better. And they tend to do much better if there are what we call affiliative statements, so people being supportive in the groups of one another and really building up that sense of self-esteem, which is already lacking in substance users, but in our females, even more so.
And yet we talked about, earlier we talked about outcomes and the challenge that Hazel and Betty Ford and that you as an addiction psychiatrist have in trying to help women have the same kind of outcome as a man as it relates to treatment. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So what we know is that for every 2 men that enters treatment, there's only 1 woman that enters treatment. So improving access in terms of, the child care component, the relational component, those are all going to impact outcomes. What we need is more access for females to improve outcomes. We need to be supporting them economically. Women tend to not make as much money as men. Their education is less, so there's a financial disparity there. And so women tend to not have the same level of insurance, which also affects treatment outcome. So all of this disparity and chaos essentially leads women away from the doors of our treatment centers. So what we need to do is really strategize and find more ways to open those doors.
So recovery management for women, treatment is certainly a tough challenge for anybody, but as I've always said, the treatment is the easy part in the scheme of things. It's what happens after we leave treatment that is so vital. And recovery management, as we now call it, is important, that we manage our recoveries. What would be your counsel to women who might be listening today in terms of how they manage their recoveries once they leave treatment?
I think it's really important that women find a group that they feel comfortable with. We know that outcomes improve when they have a peer support network that they feel really strong about. we know that they do better when there is an anchoring care provider, actually. So
What does that mean, an anchoring care provider?
yeah, so if they are with a therapist and they see that therapist while they're in residential, let's say, and then it's time for them to step down care to an outpatient experience. If they're able to stay connected with a care provider longitudinally, it dramatically increases their ability to stay sober, because you're really just taking that negative component of the relational piece that added to their use, and you're kind of flipping it and making it a part of their recovery rather than their substance use.
There are going to be women who have tuned in today either to listen to this podcast or to watch you and me here, and they're going to tune in because they're struggling. What would be your counsel for a woman who might be at home today with 2 small children, or a mom who is responsible for keeping that household intact, or has got an elderly parent living with them? What would be your counsel to a woman who's struggling today and is tuned in to hear you share?
Yeah, my counsel would be that they're worth their own recovery, and that they need to take the time for themselves to treat their substance use disorder, because some of the people they care about the most, right, are being impacted by their substance use. So that grandmother, their children, we know that specifically young girls are watching their moms, and women who have mothers who tend to smoke will then start smoking. So the kids are watching, and really it's worth it for that woman to get help for herself. She will end up helping others as a result, but she is worth it just on her own.
She is worth it just on her own. And Dr. Kristen Schmidt, thank you for bringing us your professional expertise today and that message of hope and help and healing to women and families who might be tuning in today. I'm your host, William Moyers, and on behalf of our executive producer, Lisa Stangl, we want to thank you for joining us for another edition of Let's Talk, a series of podcasts on the issues that matter to women, to men, to families, that matter to all of us. We'll see you again.